We'll go. We all set.
Okay, I guess. Okay. So, shall I start?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Uh, First of all, thank you so much for letting me do the presentation. So today I'm going to talk about gait disorders. Uh, I'm going to talk more about how to clinically approach the patient whenever we encounter the patient with a gait disorder or gait abnormalities. So, in this presentations, with this presentation, we're going to learn uh, about the normal gait cycle. Then we'll learn about the neuroanatomy of normal gait and the movement. Then we'll learn about epidemiology of gait disorders. Then we will focus on how to approach a patient with abnormal gait. And we'll end with the types of abnormal gaits. So here is the slide for a normal gait cycle. So the normal gait cycle, actually, we're gonna try to define what a single gait cycle or a stride is. So the single gait cycle or a stride is a period between one foot contacts the ground and the same foot contacts the ground again. So here below in the picture, you can see that the child has put his right leg on the ground. So your gait cycle starts from here until over here when the child puts its right leg again on the ground. So this defines the single gait cycle or a stride. Each stride has a two phases. One is a stance phase. Stance phase is defined as a portion of a gait cycle during which the foot is in the contact with the ground. So look at the bottom picture over here, where you can see that from A to E, the child's right leg is in the contact with the ground. So this entire portion of the gait cycle is defined as a stance phase. Next, another portion of the gait cycle is a swing phase. So when the foot is not in the contact with the ground, that portion is known as a swing phase. We have the video, so it will give you the better idea. So, okay. You can see that person is walking. And the right leg is a reference limb. So you can see that. Okay, so that's our gait cycle. So the next thing is the stance phase and the swing phase also have a sub components. Stance phase comprises 60% of entire gait cycle, while the swing phase comprises the 40% of entire gait cycle. Stance phase has a 5 components. First one is a heel strike. Heel strike is when the foot touches the ground. Then when we put our weight on that foot, that is known as a loading response. Then when all the weight is only on the foot that is on the ground, that phase is known as a mid stance. After that, the terminal stance comes, and then the brief period just before the swing phase is known as a pre-swing. While the swing phase has a 3 portion, one is initial swing, second is mid swing, and third is a terminal swing. Here is a video which will give the better idea. The gait cycle is separated into two main sections. Stance is when the reference limb is on the ground and this takes up approximately 3 seconds. Swing is the remaining 40% of the gait cycle. Stance The initial contact and the heel strike are the same thing.
It's fascinating.
I hope.
Video. Gosh,
I'm sorry, sir.
video is amazing.
Thank you, sir. So I hope the reason for explaining normal gait, because it is very important to understand about the normal gait. If we understand what a normal gait look like, it becomes very easy to identify and address the abnormal gait. So moving to our next slide, we'll talk about neuroanatomy. So neuroanatomy, like what anatomical parts are involved with making any movement or walking. So it starts with the primary motor cortex, pre and supplementary motor cortex. Then parietal sensory motor cortex also plays important role, and basal ganglia structures, then brainstem, cerebellar locomotor region, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves and its supplying muscles. So these all these part combining are required to make any movement or to make people walk. So we'll try to focus like how we'll try to understand briefly like how each area are involved with uh, what like how this each area are involved with making any person move. So we'll start. So before like going to describe like how these things work, I want you to all of to imagine that like we are like trying to make one movement. For example, I'm going to uh, grab this bottle. So this is, although it looks like very simple, but it's a very complex thing associated on a brief, on a eagle eye view. For example, to make this movement, first of all, the brain needs to know what the initial position is. After that, brain has to decide what tone and what muscles are needed to make the movement. And finally, it has to decide at the end of the movement what tone and what position will be required, right? So we'll try to focus, like we'll try to learn all the things keeping this reference in our mind. So for example, how primary motor cortex is involved. So primary motor cortex is situated over here, which is highlighted in orange area. It is situated just anterior to the central gyri, and it is the center of any movement execution. Primary motor cortex is also the source of most of the corticospinal axons. Then comes the pre and supplementary motor cortex. So this area that is highlighted in blue is the premotor cortex, and this area on the medial side of brain, which is highlighted in pink, is supplementary motor area. So these two areas. So basically, most movements are planned in the primary motor cortex, but some movements are planned and sequenced in the secondary motor cortex as well. Then comes the parietal cortex. So this parietal cortex is situated just posterior to the central gyrus, and it integrates sensory inputs indicating position and orientation in space the relationship to gravitational forces, the speed and the direction of movement. Then comes the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia controls the center of movement utilizing direct and indirect pathways. So let's this is just brief information, but let's try to analyze how these things work. For example, like I have just said that I want to grab this bottle. So that thought, first of all, is generated in the primary motor cortex. Then there's like, depending on that thought, the primary motor cortex decides like what muscles are needed to perform the task, right? So after that, but usually primary motor cortex are always inhibited by the thalamus, because thalamus controls the movement. So this primary motor cortex area will connect with the caudate nucleus of basal ganglia and sends the signals that I want to execute this movement, just do something. After that, the basal ganglia, utilizing the direct pathways, tells the thalamus that please decrease your firing to the cortex so that the cortex can make the movements, right? So after that, this basal ganglia inhibits thalamus, and I mean the caudate nucleus and all other parts of the basal ganglia, that inhibits the thalamus, and thalamus in turn inhibits the primary motor cortex, and then the primary motor cortex will be able to make any movements that it has been planned. Meanwhile, I told you that, before making any movements, primary motor cortex also require the information that initially what is the position of the limb. For example, my limb is relaxing on my chair arm, then primary motor cortex area needs that information, and it gets that information from this sensory parietal sensory cortex. So it provides all the information of proprioception, all the information of joint position, and the information of what tones of the muscles are there. And according to that, primary motor cortex decides what movements it requires. Then will so this how the movements are executed. After that, the cerebellum. So how the cerebellum plays a role in movement. So cerebellum, the role of cerebellum is to modulate the rate, rhythm, amplitude, and force. So cerebellum basically plays important role in coordinating movements. And how does it work? So I have briefly mentioned over here. Just please, so like we'll try to understand this figure. So over here, this area which is highlighted in purple or blue, purple color, that is your primary motor cortex. So primary motor cortex, while providing information to the descending corticospinal tract, some fibers also goes into the cerebellum. So basically cerebellum knows what plans primary motor cortex does have. So it keeps that information from peripheral skin, joints, and other parts of the body. All the proprioception information, all the information regarding what tone of the muscles are there, all sensory information travels from peripheral body to the cerebellum using another pathway, which is highlighted in blue color, right? So basically cerebellum have both the information. Cerebellum has the information what movement has been planned by motor cortex and what is going on in the periphery. And it just compares both things, that everything is going right or not. If cerebellum find any discrepancy between these two inputs, it sends the signal to the primary motor cortex utilizing another pathways, which is highlighted in green, to the primary motor cortex, and say to the primary cortex that, hey, something is going wrong. you have to modify your plan. And that's how cerebellum incorporates in any movement we make. So cerebellum is very important part in modulating and basically smoothing out the movement. In this, the next we'll learn about the epidemiology of gait disorder. So according to a Brunei's population-based study, the neurological gait disorder affects around 25% people with age more than 60 years. This is really interesting figures because once like every one person, every fourth person will have some gait problem over the 60 years of age. And over the 80 years of age, 75% people have some problem with the gait. Out of the neurological gait problem, 70% people have one distinct neurological entities, while 30% have multiple neurological causes. 6% people over the age 60 are not aware of gait disorder. Frequency of gait disorder is strongly age related. The gait disorders are more prevalent in females compared to males, and the most common cause of gait disorders are sensory ataxia, followed by Parkinson's disease. Now, how the patient will present to you. So patient will complain. For example, if the person is having difficulty with the gait, the patient might complain of a weakness. So weakness can be presented by saying that the patient has a difficulty, like patient has a patient is scraping a toe on the ground while walking. That we usually find in a foot drop, or a sensation that leg will give away while standing or walking downstairs. Patient might have a difficulty with striding forward, resulting in shallow stepped gait. Difficulty in climbing stairs or rising from seated position, which we encounter in proximal muscle weakness. Patient might have a difficulty with truncal mobility, which we usually find in axial muscle weakness. Patients sometimes also complain of a slowness. So this slowness could also be due to normal aging, or it could be a normal reaction to unstable or a slippery surface. So we have to ask patient whether you have encountered you have finding difficulty with these things or not. Slowness are classical for Parkinson's disease and any other basal ganglia disease. Patient might complain of stiffness. Like they may also tell you that patient drags their leg or catch the toes, causing stumbling and falls, which is generally seen in a spastic paraparesis or hemiparesis. There is an interesting thing that a leg muscle tone in upper motor neuron syndromes and dystonia may be normal when the patient is examined in a supine position, but is increased during walking. So we have to keep in mind that, you know, when the patient complains something like that, and we ask them to lie supine and we check for a muscle tone, sometimes we found a normal tone. Patient may complain of imbalance, where the patient will have wide base unsteady gait, which usually seen in cerebellar ataxia, sensory ataxia, or vestibulopathy. The imbalance while turning, stepping backwards, or bending over to pick up something suggests subcortical cerebrovascular disease and basal ganglia disorder. Patient might complain of falls. So whenever you encounter a patient who complains of fall, it could also be due to a carelessness, secondary to inattention, dementia, or a poor vision. Second thing, you ask for a muscle tone, whether the muscle tone is lost or not. If the muscle tone is lost, then it is known as a collapsing falls, which we usually found in syncope or a seizure. If the muscle tone is retained, then it is known as a toppling falls, and which is secondary to impaired body equilibrium during standing and walking. Some patient might complain of a sensory symptoms and pain. For example, the patient might complain of pain, paresthesia, decreased or altered sensations, sensations of tight bend around the trunk, or a neurogenic claudication of coda equina. With the sensory symptoms, if we find out the distribution of any accompanying sensory complaints, it provides a clue to a site of the lesion producing walking difficulties. So the sensory examination is very important while we encounter this kind of patient, because it will give you the basic idea like what part of brain is involved. Some patient also complains of urinary incontinence, which is especially seen with a spinal cord lesion or a parasagittal cerebral lesion such as frontal lobe tumor, frontal lobe infarction caused by stroke, and hydrocephalus. Urinary urgency and urinary incontinence are also common in Parkinson and subcortical white matter ischemia. Some patient also complains of cognitive changes. So this is really interesting because slowing of gait may be the marker of impending cognitive impairment and dementia. It works both ways. The executive dysfunction or cognitive decline, including inattention, impaired multitasking, and set switching, may predict later development of falls in older adults without dementia and impaired mobility. So usually what happens, we focus more on a neurological aspects of uh, neurological pictures of patient, and we tend to forget ask about these things, but this is really important to address. Now we will talk about the examination. How should we examine the patient? So examination begins as soon as the patient enters the office. We have to keep our eyes on a patient, how the patient is walking towards you. But while formally examining, make sure patient's both legs are exposed. Then ask a patient to walk normally for at least 5 to 6 steps. Then ask the patient to turn around and walk back. But before jumping to any neurological causes, I want all of us to keep in mind that we should always exclude these things. For example, pain. Some patient might have just pain due to a sepsis. For example, we have encountered the patient on that day where the patient has, I think, abscess around a hip area, and she was having a difficult gait. So probably it might not be the neurological problem. It is just a gait due to a pain, abnormal gait due to pain. So always ask a patient before jumping to a neurological, before thinking about any neurological causes that patient, whether patient is having pain or not. Then ask a patient about vision loss, or if the patient is having any joint disease or impairment. For example, arthritis or contracture in legs can also give rise to the abnormal gait. Then ask if either patient is having any injury or trauma to the legs. Muscle weakness or myopathy in general, for example, secondary to if the patient is on steroid and patient is having a myopathy secondary to it, then it can also give rise to abnormal gait. Sometimes impaired central processing in case of dementia, stroke, delirium, or patient is intoxicated with drugs, that can also give rise to the abnormal gait. So always exclude before thinking about any neurological causes. So when we ask a patient to walk, turn and walk back to ourselves, what should we examine while patient is walking? So when we ask a patient to stand up from the sitting position, check for a proximal muscle strength and stability. While patient is standing, look for the posture, look for the stance, and look for whether a patient is having any body sway or not. While the patient is walking, look for initiation of stepping, then speed and length, step length. Then look for symmetry and smoothness of steps. Look for step trajectories. For example, whether patient is having shallow shuffling or a high stepping gait or not. Then also look for associated trunk and arm movements. While the patient is making turn, count the numbers of a steps it requires to turn. Count for a number of steps, stabilizing steps, then look for a truncal and leap movement. Also look for patient has any freezing or not. Other maneuvers are you ask patient to perform or ask a patient to walk backward, ask a patient to walk on heels and toes, then perform a tandem gait, perform the Romberg's test, and also perform the postural reflex or pool test. Then do a complete neurological examination and complete general physical examination, because with that you will have the clue about what causes the abnormal gait. Once we confirm that this gait could be due to some neurological issues, we can order a following test to identify its cause. The blood investigation usually we run our full blood count, peripheral blood smear, serum B12 level, blood glucose level, urine and electrolyte tests, syphilis serology, serum creatinine kinase. The other imaging studies are important to identify the cause are MRI of a brain, spinal MRI, spinal X-ray, then nerve conduction study, then do electromyography, and also do a CT scan of a thorax to look for any abnormalities or a tumor that can metastasize to brain and can give rise to the abnormal gait. So now we will discuss about what types of gaits are. So first one is hemiplegic spastic gait. So usually we find this gait in a stroke patient, which leads to hemiparesis. So when the patient is having a stroke involving one side of a primary frontal motor cortex, that upper motor neuron lesion will result in flexed elbow, extended knee, and plantar flexed ankle. So basically, due to this overtone of the muscle, increased tone of the muscle, patient cannot flex its knee, right? It's leg at the knee, that leads so that in order to save its leg scraping from the ground, patient usually swung its leg in a lateral arc, and the pelvis is elevated to avoid the scraping of the foot. So here is the video which will give you the better idea. So you can see that knee is not flexed enough, the pelvis is also not flexed enough, and so in order to save its leg from scraping, patient is making the lateral arc. Okay. Yes. So that's basically the hemiplegic spastic gait. Now we'll move to the next one. The another type of gait is a Scheser gait or a diplegic gait, which usually is seen in a cerebral palsy patient or a myelopathy. This is also upper motor neuron lesion, which results in hypertonia in legs, hips, and pelvis, and also results in a bilateral spastic paresis of legs. like which results into like that gives rise to the thighs that are extremely abducted. And sometimes, knees and thighs while walking, they are so close that they hit to each other and sometimes even cross to each other. That's why it is given a name of seizure gait. Here is the video. You can see that the patient is literally making a movement as if, seizure is going forward. And this is like the patient was managed well, and now he's doing a better compared to when he was first diagnosed. This is another example where you can see that a knee are so close, hips are so abducted that it keeps touching to each other. Okay, so that is a seizure gait or a diplegic gait. The next gait is a hypokinetic gait, which is seen in a Parkinson's disease. Patient basically lacks a dopamine, which is produced from substantia nigra, and which is an important part of basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia cannot work properly, and due to that reason, the patient who is having a Parkinson disease will have a short, shuffling gait. Patient will have a stooped posture. Patient have a difficulty initiating movements. Patient will have increased cadence. Now, what is cadence? So cadence is basically a number of steps that requires in certain amount of time. So if the person is really taking a slow or a short steps, then for a given time, it will require more steps to reach, right? So that's why with the Parkinson or hypokinetic gait, there will be an increased cadence. There will be a freezing. So patient sometimes, freeze. He cannot move, or patient may festinates. So festinates, it's like patient becomes really unsteady. And so he thinks that he might get fallen down, and to save himself from falling down, he tries to grab anything around it. And to grab anything around it makes a really fast movement. So that is known as a festinates. Patient might also have a difficulty turning, or you may notice a loss of arm swing. Other associated symptoms of Parkinson disease may also present, such as resting tremor, stiffness, cogwheel rigidity, masked face, soft or low voice, or cognitive decline. So here is the video. So you can see that the patient's arm are not moving properly. Patient is taking really short steps. And you can also see the contour is slightly bent. Here is the another example where you can see the small steps. And here you have the freezing. So patient is literally freeze while turning. Now the patient will have difficulty with initiating the movement. See, you can see that patient cannot initiate the movement. So that was our hypokinetic gait. Next is a waddling gait. So in waddling gait, what happens is while we are making a move, we need our pelvis stabilize. So in order to move, make our pelvis stabilize, the abductors and the extension are required, which are supplied by superior gluteal nerve. And the muscle that are involved with stabilizing the pelvis is a gluteus medius. So whenever we have a difficulty with a nerve involving gluteal nerve, superior gluteal nerve, or a gluteus medius, that will give rise to the waddling gait. So which is generally seen in myopathies, bilateral superior gluteal nerve palsy, L5 radiculopathy, or gluteus medius tendon avulsion, which is commonly seen after hip surgery, hip replacement surgery. So over here, you have a weakness of a proximal leg and hip girdle muscles. Patient will have a difficulty with stabilizing the pelvis and legs on the trunk. There will be the exaggerated rotation of pelvis with each step. Hips are slightly flexed as a result of weakness of hip extension, and exaggerated lumbar lordosis also be there. Patient also shows a positive Gower's sign, which we usually found in the children. Okay, so this is our waddling gait. You can see that patient is moving side to side while walking. So the next is apraxic or magnetic gait, which is usually seen in a lesions in the frontal lobe. It could be due to stroke, tumor, any demyelinating disorders, Alzheimer's disease, or normal pressure hydrocephalus. So whenever you have a frontal lobe, like difficult lesion in the frontal lobe, that patient will have a difficulty in initiating gaits. Their feet feel like literally glued to the ground. The base when they are standing could be variable, like could be narrow or a wide. The patient will have a short shuffling gait and disequilibrium. Patient will have a start and a turn hesitation. So these are all features which we may also find in a Parkinson disease, right? Hypokinetic gait. So how do we differentiate it from hypokinetic gait? Is there will be there so with particular apraxic gait, the other features of a Parkinson disease or other symptoms will be missing over here. For example, the patient's arm movement will be normal. So let's see the video. So you can see that patient's feet are literally feels like they are glued to the ground. You can literally feel that. See, he's trying to pull the leg from the ground. So it feels like, you know, the patient is feeling like its feet is glued to the ground. So the next is a steppage gait, which usually we found when we have a difficulty with common peroneal nerve, which is involved in a dorsiflexion of the foot. So when the patient has a difficulty in dorsiflexion of the foot, which will result in a foot drop. So if the patient, so unilateral causes are L5 radiculopathy, sciatic nerve, which give rise to the peroneal nerve. So if the patient is having neuropathy of sciatic nerve or peroneal nerve, that can also give rise to this gait. Or the bilateral causes are distal polyneuropathy and lumbosacral polyradiculopathies. So basically, patient will have a weakness of ankle dorsiflexion, which results in a foot drop. Foot is lifted high on the walking so that the foot cannot drag on the floor, right? So this is the video. You can see that patient is making, you know, move with, is keeping its foot very high from the ground. You can also see the foot drop. Okay. In another word, if in another side, if there is a weakness on the ankle plantar flexion, right, that produces, if the patient has a weakness on a plantar flexion, then the foot will remain on the dorsiflexion somehow. And that produces the shallow stepped gait, which is commonly found in femoral neuropathy, because femoral nerve ultimately supplies all the muscles that are required for the plantar flexion of the ankle or foot. The next gait is a cerebellar gait, which is seen in a cerebellar disorder. In this case, the patient will have a broad-based gait. Patient will unable to perform tandem gait. Patient feels clumsy, unsteady, and patient reels towards the affected side. There will be lurching or a staggering, which are more pronounced while walking on a narrow base or during heel to toe walking, resembling acute alcohol intoxication. So here is the thing. So you can see that patient is walking with a broad gaze. And when the patient is asked to stand with its feet together, patient will become unsteady. You can see that. So yes. So the another gait is sensory ataxia, which is also known as a stamping gait, which seen in a large diameter peripheral neuropathies, dorsal root ganglionopathies, dorsal column lesions. Over here, patient also has a wide base stance. Patient advance cautiously. Patient will have a slow steps under visual guidance. Sole of the foot strikes floor forcibly with slapping sound. So basically what happens is, like, patient has a sensory neuropathy. So patient does not feel the floor. So in order to get the idea where the foot is, it hardly hits the ground, so that it makes a little bit sound. That so with that, the patient will have the idea where it is putting its leg. Over here, the patient will have a positive rhombic test. So this is like, there are lots of similarity between the cerebral gait and the sensory ataxia. So like I want to explain like how these things work. So basically, cerebellum plays an important role in maintaining balance and equilibrium, and it requires inputs from three things. One is a visual input. Second is a vestibular nerve, from the vestibular nerve, and third, in the form of proprioception from the peripheral nerves. In order to make the balance, you at least need 2 out of 3. So when the patient have a cerebral, the lesion with the cerebellum or a problem with the cerebellum, it doesn't matter how many inputs or from where it is getting the input, the cerebellum is not able to comprehend or process all the inputs. You will have the steady unsteadiness. Even if you remove the visual input, even if you remove the vestibular input, it doesn't matter. So in that case, when we ask a patient just to stand with their legs close to each other, patient will feel unsteady. Over here, although patient is not having sensory information, the visual input and vestibular input compensate for that. So for example, when we ask a patient to keep their feet together, patient will not feel unsteady. But when we ask a patient to close the eyes, we are removing the visual inputs. So now the cerebral have only one inputs, that is from the vestibule, and it cannot make a proper balance utilizing that input. Due to that reason, when we ask a patient to close its eyes, and if the patient is having sensory neuropathy, peripheral neuropathy, patient will sway away or patient feel unsteady. So that's the positive Romberg test. So over here we can see that when we ask a patient with the feet close together, it does not have any difficulties. But when we ask a patient to close the eyes, see, now the patient will feel unsteady. So the same thing happens with vestibular if somebody has a problem with the vestibule. So basically, whenever the patient, like anybody have a problem with the vestibule, the cerebellum relies on other two components of visual inputs and proprioception. So usually in a day, usually the patient will not have any difficulty maintaining gait, but when the patient closes its eyes or patient is walking in a dark, then it will like patient will have a difficulty maintaining a gait or maintaining balance. So vestibular imbalance and a gait. So there are two general type of causes: the peripheral causes and central causes. So in peripheral, if the patient is having middle or inner ear infection, neuropathy involving vestibular nerve, if there are any tumor in the ear or a skull which is compressing the vestibular nerve, or the patient have any trauma to the head or ear. The central causes are the infection of the brain, any central tumor or inflammatory disease such as multiple sclerosis, or the patient is having thiamine deficiency. So all these things can impair the vestibular function and can give rise to the vestibular gait. So if the patient have an acute problem with the vestibular nerve, then the Romberg test will be positive. Patient would lean towards the side of the lesion, and the patient may also have associated symptoms with the ear, such as tinnitus, earfulness, or altered hearing. In case of chronic vestibular failure, because when the problem is chronic, then other two components, such as visual component and proprioception component, they try to compensate. And due to that reason, patient might not have a difficulty with the gait. So gait, sometimes you may found a gait normal, but the patients, when we ask to perform a Romberg test, it turns out to be positive, and there will be a marked hearing loss with the chronic vestibular failure. So another type is flocculonodular lobe. The flocculonodular lobe is very important structure of a cerebellum, which is involved in locomotor function. If we have a lesion in a flocculonodular lobe, then the patient will have a multi-directional body sway and disequilibrium. The impairment will be so severe that patient cannot even stand or sit properly. It will be very difficult for them. Although when we ask a patient to lie down, the heel shine test may appear normal and the upper limb function may be relatively preserved. The another type is choreic gait. So you will find the random movements of chorea, which are often most noticeable during walking, which we usually find in Huntington's chorea. The another type of psychogenic gait disorders, another type of gait is psychogenic gait disorders, where I'm sorry. So psychogenic gait disorders, where the patient will have astasia abasia, which is in simple word, the patient will have inability to stand or walk in a normal manner. Gait does not have any distinct pattern. So you cannot identify, like you cannot put, like examining the gait, that you cannot put that patient into any category. There will be a normal coordination of leg movements in bed or while sitting. The patient will be unable to stand or walk without assistance. But interestingly, if distracted, sometimes the stationary balance is maintained and several steps are taken normally, followed by a dramatic demonstration of imbalance. So it is really important to identify this type of gait disorder. And the last but not least, these are the gaits of some super happy people. So I just want all of us not to look at the world with the neurological on only with the neurological eyes, because it would be very difficult to live with if we do that. Thank you.
It was a very nice
Okay.
presentation,
Yes,
Dr.
I really
Satasya.
enjoyed